April 17, 1943. 5:12 hours. Southern Tunisia. The ground shudders even before the sirens do, a low, rolling tremor that seems to rise from the bedrock itself, as if the desert has decided to speak. Inside a reinforced command post carved into limestone. 3 rooms deep, 2 doors thick, roofs braced with French concrete poured before the war. A British engineer named Captain Roland Price watches a daylight raid die on the surface. The bombs bloom. The dust plumes. The roof doesn't crack. The walls don't move. The air in the third chamber stays cool and stale. Price glances at the inclinometer on his improvised vibration rig. Peak acceleration, barely 1/3 of what's needed to shift the ceiling. The Germans have learned quickly. If you can't outfly the bombers, outhide them. Move underground. Bury your logistics. Sink your war into rock. The plan for the day had been simple enough. Level the switchboard of this underground radio complex. Blind the local Panzergruppe for the afternoon. Punch a hole for the infantry. But the bombs that punish a factory roof do nothing to a limestone spine. The squadron lead calls it in, clipped and angry. Surface damage. No penetration. Price looks back at the chalkboard on the wall. Pencil sketches of penetrator casings, numbers circled and recircled. Impact velocity. Steel hardness. Fuse delay. He'd believed, as many did then, that the path to cracking a bunker was a thicker shell and a longer delay. Drop from higher. Hit harder. Wait longer. Let gravity and chemistry do the work. Today, gravity loses. 3 miles away in a hastily reinforced quarry, a different kind of sound chews at the morning. It's a drill, not the neat bite of a machinist's bench drill, not the screaming angle grinder of a fitter, but a tortured, uneven howl like a dog with its paw caught in barbed wire. A man with road dust in his eyebrows and granite dust fused into the calluses of his hands leans into the machine, shoulders squared, mouth set. He's not Army. He's not even a contractor. He's a miner. Name, Thomas Tommy Armitage. Birth, 1904, Derbyshire. Education, the seam. Job title before the war. Lead driller in a narrow-vein lead and fluorspar mine, where Strata punished mistakes with cave-ins and life was measured in inches of rock moved per shift. The Army requisitioned the quarry to test charges. Tommy followed the trucks not because he was asked, but because he saw the trucks filled with exactly the wrong shapes, exactly the wrong ideas about rock, going to meet the wrong kind of problem. He watches the Army men argue over casings and fuse settings and tells them, quietly, "You're thinking like bombers, not like rock men." Price hears him. Price, whose best friend back in school was a quarryman's son. Price, who knows that air war is about speed and altitude until it isn't, until the target lives not in the air at all. He brings Tommy into the perimeter, past the raised eyebrows, past the grins. The miner sets his drill down, pulls a stub of carpenter's pencil from his pocket, and sketches a shape on the back of an ammunition packing slip. It's a drill head, but not like the Army's idea of a drill head. The soldier engineers think of drills like needles, pointy, straight, piercing by force. Tommy draws a spiral that isn't a simple twist. It's asymmetric with an offset mass. He shades one side heavier. He draws 4 flutes not equally spaced but staggered, too shallow, too deep. Then he adds something that makes the men lean closer. A small, canted shoe on the nose, angled off-axis by a few degrees. That, he says, will make it walk. Walk. Price asks. You don't want straight down, Tommy says. Not in layered rock or concrete. Straight down is how you bind and shatter your own bit. You want precession. You want the head to hunt, to find weak grain and force a wedge. You want it to cut a path wider than itself without breaking its neck. You want it to pull rock out and push strength in at the same time. He taps the shaded side. Mass here, she'll press S under load. She won't chatter. She'll bite. She'll carve you a tunnel with fewer chips and less heat. And because she's walking, she'll store energy in the bend. When she lets go, it'll go somewhere useful. Price hasn't heard anyone talk about drilling like this. Not like a mathematician chasing a perfect axis, but like a man who's been trapped under a roof and knows the difference between living and not living is how much dust your lungs can stand before the rescue comes. The Army men point out the obvious. Bombs aren't drills. They don't rotate. They don't have feed pressure. They don't get to take a breath, pull out, clear chips, go again. They get one impact, one bite, one chance to drive. Tommy doesn't argue. He nods. Then build the drill head into the bomb. The room stills. The idea sounds insane, because it is. But insane is how anything new sounds to men who have been taught that the physics is done and the only thing left is to buy more of it. Tommy's sketch explodes into a handshake of two worlds, impact dynamics and rock mechanics. He lays it out as simply as a man can who's taught with gestures and scars more than with chalk. A standard bomb hits a roof, tries to remain a rigid projectile, and either shatters the casing or glances off cracks. A penetrator with a perfect point goes in a bit further and then mushrooms, bleeding velocity into pulverized concrete and into fracture waves that move around the casing and leave it trapped in a sort of self-made cement. A sphere would crater but not bite. A needle would bite and snap. But a canted nose, mass offset, spiral fluted drill bomb, if it can be made tough enough to survive the first contact, will do something different. It will skew on impact just enough to begin a controlled precession, a forced wobble that makes the nose trace a tight circle inside the hole. The offset mass and canted shoe force the bomb to cut its own clearance, to break the brittle matrix in shear rather than brute compression. The deep flutes scoop and carry debris back along the casing, reducing the in-hole pressure at the nose. And that means the bomb can keep going, staying cooler, straighter precisely because it isn't straight. It's walking. And at the heart of the nose, buried behind the shoe, Tommy wants a core pin made of something the Army men will have to beg from wherever Britain hides its last truly hard steel. Air hardening, oil quenched, a devil of a thing to machine. It'll be a sacrificial spine, he says. It'll eat everything that tries to break it first. Price pushes the packing slip back toward him and says one word, prototype. In the next 9 days, the quarry becomes a foundry without a roof. A blacksmith from Sidi Bouzid turns truck leaf springs into test coupons, while a machinist curses a lathe that shakes itself across the floor, trying to cut an asymmetric nose without a jig. The men sleep in shifts. Tommy grinds, taps, fits, and throws away the first 3 noses because they chatter in his hand like frightened animals. On the 4th build, he welds a counterweight into the spiral, fills 2 flutes with lead to force imbalance, and cants the shoe by 2.7 degrees because he likes the way 2.5 felt in his palm, but wants just a touch more grab. They sleeve a spent bomb body with forged collars to take the new head. They argue over fuse timing until the sun goes down and comes up and goes down again. Price wants a long delay. Get as deep as possible before the bang. Tommy shakes his head. You don't want deep. You want under. He taps the sketch where he's drawn not a crater, but a lens-shaped cavity beneath a slab. If you make a hole under what holds, the weight does the rest. Let it breathe, then take it. First test. A slab poured by French engineers in 1935 for a rail overpass, 6 feet thick, steel so tired it sings when you strike it. They set the chassis on a gantry, aim it down, drop it from a crane because they have no bomber to spare. The nose hits. There is no spectacular mushroom. There is a sound like a carpenter's gouge finding soft grain, and then a series of awful, rapid, bass-heavy thumps as the mass walks, precessing in a tight circle, cutting a clearance for itself. Dust belches. The slab does not crack. For a moment the hole steams. Then, from somewhere inside, a deeper note arrives, stone moving against stone where no one can see. When they lift the rig away, there is a hole with a shimmering char around it, edges not exploded but abraded, lipped in a faint helix. The bomb halted 2 feet in. Not enough. Price bites his lip. Tommy shrugs. Too soft a spine. Wrong shoe angle for this steel. She hunted but didn't hold. They go again. Harder spine. Cobalt in the alloy. Nose shoe at 3.2 degrees. Deeper flutes to carry dust. They rig a crude rotational head for the drop. Just a crosswind vane that will spin the body enough to keep the nose's precession from dampening too soon. Second drop. The precession footprint tightens. The hole grows a clean shoulder. The body drives to 4 feet, then stops dead because the fuse housing warped under load and jammed against crushed stone that the flutes didn't clear fast enough. A failure, but a useful one. She wants to run. Tommy says, "You've got to let her." By the week's end, they have something that looks like a weapon from a future where engineers and miners get drunk together. The nose is a candid star. The flutes gleam in hand-polished valleys. The core pin is a monster. The body is standard because that is what they have. The tail has directional stabilizers set not for perfect straightness, but for the little bit of spin that will keep the nose awake. Price finds a pilot with the nerves and the clearance to take a single, ugly, experimental object aloft and drop it exactly where a flaw in a mountainside hides a remarkable thing. A German telephone exchange embedded behind a poured concrete front, fed by tunnels, braced by stone. They've marked it with a flare ship at dawn. The surface has shrugged off everything before it. The pilot whispers to the object and lets it go. From the hillside, Price watches through field binoculars as an impossible sight unfolds. A bomb that does not skip. It bites, it wobbles, it disappears in a grinding belch of gray. The surface shudders. The slab does not shatter. The hillside seems to inhale and then, after 4 long, blank seconds, exhale in a slow subsidence that grows and grows until the concrete face bows in and the braces inside pop like toothpicks. The top third of the portal sinks into a cavity that didn't exist when the sun came up. Less an explosion than a betrayal. Gravity deciding it's had enough of being conscripted by men. If the story ended there, it would be a good tale for a bar. It doesn't. The phone net goes dark for a day. An infantry captain sends a letter to someone who knows someone who can get things moved. Price writes a report that reads like blasphemy to an Air Corps steeped in straight lines. He argues for bombs that try to be drills. He gets polite silence, then interest, then a visit. The visitor is a short, careful man with eyes like a draftsman's ruler and an accent Tommy can't place. He asks for the nose, the metallurgical notes, the shoe angle. He asks for the man who thought of walking instead of plunging. Tommy offers his hand with a cautious grin, the grin of a man who's had his ideas called daft by foremen and then used, quietly, that very night. The visitor shakes once and says this: "We have a man in England who is thinking about going around the target rather than through it. You have thought of going through it by going around inside the hole. You will like this. The Army's official channels move how they move, committees, forms, tests. But the field has its own timelines. Within weeks, Price and Tommy have permission to keep playing in the quarry, to swap the core pin for a different alloy when the heat treat behaves like a liar, to machine the shoe as a removable wedge so they can tune angle for different concrete mix designs, to try a twisted flare tail that spins more at low air speeds and less at high. They discover small truths by breaking expensive things. A nose shoe at 2.0 degrees compacts dust in quartzite and stalls. At 3.5 degrees, it bites too hard in young concrete and induces a fracture arc that kills the hole at 18 inches. The sweet spot in limestone is not the sweet spot in granite. You need to read the rock before you fly the bomb. Tommy makes a pocket guide no one asked for. Where to aim for bedding planes, how to spot aggregate composition from surface color, what to do if the steel streaks are brown, old rod, lower yield, or blue, higher carbon, brittle. The guide circulates like contraband among the few crews who know to ask for it. Price smiles at the rumors he hears in mess tents, that somewhere in North Africa there's a mad miner building bombs that walk. Late in 1943, the war jumps theaters for 1,000 different reasons. The problems and solutions jump with it. Deep in northern Italy, a stubborn hillside holds a mouth the Germans have strengthened with layered concrete and stone backfill. A road runs over it. The Allies need the road. They need the tunnel gone. The first strike does what first strikes do. Scorches, scares, makes headlines without changing the fact that men under roofs can wait longer than fuel in tanks can burn. Price goes on leave at last and rides a freighter to an airfield he has only seen on maps. Tommy goes home to Derbyshire long enough to remember why he left. The seam, the cold. Then a call. A group in England is looking for ideas that punch. Some of their ideas involve weight and perfect shapes and the silent, terrifying patience of gravity. They want to add something that bites. Price and Tommy stand in a drafty hangar beside a weapon so heavy it changes the pitch of conversations nearby, and so smooth it looks like it could slip through water without leaving a ripple. The tall man with the draftsman's eyes nods at the nose and says, gently, humbly, "We have a way to make the ground do what we want. Perhaps your way will help us ask more nicely." The grand machines that followed in later years would be remembered by names and numbers and by black and white footage of roofs heaving like canvas under wind. This story is not about those names, not directly. This story is about a nose you could hold in your hands, a wedge of hardened thinking that taught a bomb how to become less of a hammer and more of a chisel. It is about a man who believed stubbornly that straight was not always strong, that the quickest line to the heart of a problem might trace a tight circle in a hole while everyone else watched the surface. There were tests, enough to make men grumble about wasted diesel, and enough to make other men stare at graphs until their eyes crossed. They built stacks of concrete slabs with different aggregate ratios, different rebar densities, different cure times. They poured limestone grit into coffers. They built a poor man's bunker out of leftover steel rails from a siding cut short by a bureaucrat's budget. They built a box of rock and pride, and then took it apart with a series of noses that all looked the same to men who didn't know what to look for. The best days ended with swearing and hugging in equal measure. The worst days ended with a nose shattered in a way that told Tommy he'd been arrogant. "She told me she doesn't like that angle with that mix," he'd say. "She told me with pieces in my face." When they finally wrote down the rules, they found they had not invented new physics so much as insisted that the old physics be applied in a place people weren't used to applying it. Precession isn't magic. It's a form of energy bookkeeping. If you can force a rotating mass to move its axis, you can store energy in a motion that wants to straighten. If you can shape the path of that want, you can decide which fracture will run and which will die. If you can give debris a path out that is not the same path the tool needs to take in, you can keep the tool alive. If you can make a bomb act like a tool long enough for a fuse to wait like a gentleman, you can ask gravity to finish the work with you. There are stories within the story, good ones. A nose that rattled itself out of true on a rail wagon and bored a crooked hole that taught them that field handling is part of weapon design. A farmer in Apulia who watched 3 practice drops and said, "It sounds like a dog digging." A chaplain who blessed the hole on the day a roof fell in and then apologized to God for blessing a hole. Men who had learned to hammer learned to listen, and what they heard was not thunder, but grinding. They learned the sound of concrete shearing at the aggregate paste interface, the low ripping sound that told you the flutes were carrying debris as intended, the faint whine that meant the shoe angle was wrong, the awful scream that said you had made a perfect shape for the wrong day. On a wet, gray morning in early 1944, when the war had learned new languages for terror, and there were teenagers who could sleep through an air raid and wake for nothing but coffee, Price read a memorandum that said, in the careful bureaucrat's voice that seems to apologize for its own existence, that some of the ideas from North Africa had been adapted for application to heavy airframes. He went outside and sat on a crate and did nothing for an hour. He thought about a lad in Derbyshire sorting bolts by touch. He thought about the men who had told him that the rock would do as it liked. He thought about the way the ground had heaved like something ashamed of a lie when the cavity took the roof's pride out from under it. Tommy did not get a medal then. He would be offered something later, and he would say he didn't drill for ribbons. He got a letter from a captain in a regiment he'd never meet that said a weapon with a nose like the one he'd drawn had made a mountain cough and a tunnel gasp, and 100 men leave a darkness they had thought would be their grave. He kept that letter in the same pocket where he kept his pencil. He took it out when he was drunk, and when he was alone, and when he was neither. He did not tell his sons about it until they found it after he was gone, the paper brittle, the words like a wire pulled tight. In the years no one had time to name because there were other names that demanded attention. Men who wore ties instead of aprons took the ideas from the quarry and dressed them in better steel and in guidance systems that could think the way a bird thinks about wind. They built bodies that did not need to borrow collars from old bomb casings. They built fuses that could count teeth on a gear with a precision that would have seemed like witchcraft in the quarry. They built tails that could decide how much to spin in a thin air at high speed without tearing themselves free. And they never quite forgot the thing Tommy had said when a major argued for more delay. Always more delay. It's not how long you wait. It's where you wait. If this were a story told by men who sell things, it would end with a catalog. It does not. It ends the way it started, with a sound. Not the blast. Not the cheer. The sound of a tool doing what it was made to do. A grinding, terrible sound that feels wrong in the chest until you remember that we ask our cleverest machines to imitate what our hands learned before there were machines, that we cut, we wedge, we pry, we twist, and then we finish with a push that is more persuasion than force. A bomb that thinks it is a drill is only a bomb if your world is the roof. If your world is the ground beneath the roof, it is a very persuasive argument. There was a day late in the war when Tommy brought a boy to the quarry. The boy had been told not to touch anything. He touched everything. He touched the flutes and said they felt like the grooves on his father's old knife. He touched the shoe and said it looked like a smile. He touched the core pin and said a word he'd been taught not to say. Tommy laughed and said it too. He told the boy that rock keeps its promises if you keep yours. He told him that straight lines are for paper. He told him that a good tool asks the work what it wants. He told him that he had once made a bomb that asked rock a question. The boy said, "What did it ask?" Tommy said, "It asked, which way will you fall if I take this bit away?" And the rock said, "Finally, someone's asking me." An old officer, retired and rounder than he'd prefer, came to the quarry after the war with a cane he didn't truly need and a look in his eye that said he'd lost other things he couldn't name. He shook Tommy's hand and said he had come to see where a very odd idea had been born. Tommy gestured toward the slab that had broken, the slab that had not, the slab they kept for visitors who wanted to hear the sound. The old officer put his palm on the broken edge and said, "I spent my life believing breaking was all noise and flash. Then I learned that the best breaking is quiet, and it happens in the places we can't see, because we weren't meant to build there in the first place. They stood together in the shade of a wall that had been destroyed twice and rebuilt twice and never quite looked the same after, because nothing ever does. Men die, tools rust, ideas move. The quarry filled with water after the rains and became a pond where children threw rocks to watch the rings. Tommy cut the nose off one of the old prototypes and put it on his mantle and told his wife it was a paperweight. Price wrote papers that other men signed and drank too much good tea when the news was good and too much bad gin when it wasn't. Neither man was good at sleeping. Both were good at watching. Years later, when wars had changed shape again and the enemies had learned new ways to live under rock and steel, a young engineer looked at an old drawing and asked her mentor why the shoe was canted by exactly 3.2 degrees in a certain model, when the math called for 3.0. The mentor said, "Because a miner said so." The engineer waited for a laugh. There wasn't one. The mentor said, "Sometimes the part 2/10 out of spec is the part that saves your life," and then told a story about a quarry and a slab and a bomb that walked. There is a lie we tell ourselves about invention because it makes for better speeches and nicer statues. The lie is that people with degrees and budgets design new futures in neat rooms full of whiteboards, and that men with dirty hands install the future. Sometimes that's true. Often it is not. The future is a bodged weld that holds better than a clean one ever will. A training manual with greasy fingerprints on the 2 pages that matter. A delay fuse adjusted with a pocket knife because the right screwdriver never made it through supply. The future in this story is a nose that breaks the rules of symmetry on purpose and a fluted valley cut a hair deeper by a man who would never be allowed to sign the drawing. The future is an argument between a major and a minor, and the minor wins because the rock listens only to one of them. When people ask how a miner's insane drill design created the first bunker buster, tell them this. The miner didn't make a bomb at all. He made a way for a bomb to become a tool long enough to do what tools do. Remove material exactly where it matters so that the rest of the work can be finished by forces older than war. He taught a falling object to act like a rotating one by giving it a nose that refused to behave. He taught engineers to trust a wobble. He taught officers to wait in the right place. He taught the ground to say yes. Some nights, when the wind is wrong and the pond in the old quarry throws sounds back at the houses that have grown up around it, you can hear a grinding that has no source, a bass growl under the frogs. It is probably nothing. The mind likes patterns. But if you listen with the right kind of ears, you might hear a man cursing a shoe angle that isn't right yet, a lathe walking across a plank floor, a boy saying a bad word about a core pin he isn't strong enough to lift. You might hear the rock clearing its throat to admit that it was impressed. You might hear a new thing learning to speak in an old language. Not blast, not boom, but chew, and then quiet, and then the long, low exhale that means a roof has decided to sit down. The story does not belong to the nation that used the idea, or to the service that shaped it, or to the branch that took the credit, or to the factory that machine-finished a design into something beautiful. It belongs to a man who looked at a problem and said, "You are not what you seem." It belongs to the moment a tool becomes more than its shape because someone bothered to think about how the material would answer. It belongs to the ground, which is older than us and more patient, and which will accept any bribe if it is offered with the right leverage. It belongs to anyone who has ever stood in front of a wall and thought, maybe not straight, maybe around. At the end of his life, when breath was a drill that wouldn't quite bite and sleep was a fuse that kept mistiming, Tommy kept the nose on the mantle and a small blue notebook in a drawer. The notebook was full of numbers and little drawings of spirals and dog-eared pages that smelled faintly of oil. On the last page he had written, in a hand steadier than it had any right to be, a sentence that was either a joke or a prayer. If you can't go through, walk. His grandson found the notebook and the letter and the nose and asked what it all meant. The family argued kindly about whether to donate the nose to a museum. They did. The museum put it in a case with a card that said Prototype Penetrator Nose, Quarry Series, 1943. People walked by. Some stopped. A few of those few recognized the angle on the shoe and smiled, because they had met it in a different country in a different decade where it wore a different name and did a different job for the same reason. The story survives because it fits in a pocket. Not the nose, not the bomb, not the graph. The idea. The idea that the shortest line is not always the best path. The idea that wobble is not failure. The idea that rock tells the truth if you ask a question shaped like a tool. The idea that unlikely men carry answers. The idea that the ground can be convinced. And if anyone in a briefing room asks you why this matters now, in a world of guidance and composites and codes, you say, because bunkers aren't walls. They're promises. And the only way to break a promise is not to shout louder at it, but to remove the piece of ground it stands on so quietly that it has to admit what it is without it. Then you walk away. You don't cheer. You don't write a speech. You just make a note. Shoe angle, 3.2. Flutes, too deep, too shallow. Core pin, oil quenched, tempered back one color. Then you get back to work, because the ground has more to teach, and you have a pencil, and there is always another slab.